Okay, let's continue with the CRUD operations. And we're working on this update path. And we've done the first one, which was the update. And there we're going to get the user to type in an employee number. What we need to do now is we actually need to move on to the middle page. And of course, what this middle page is going to do is it's going to take an employee number that's been entered, like here, for example, and we're going to bring up those details in a form. Now, it has to be said, this is the most complicated bit of code that we've written so far, emp update response. We're going to do lots and lots of things that we've done before, and we'll combine them all to get this nice effect where values are going to be pulled from a database and then printed into a form so the user can actually edit the details. So let's have a look at it. So we start off with creating a connection through to the database, and we're going to do that using those connection variables and that library code that we've got. And once we do that, we're going to write our SQL and we'll get a result from the database. So that the first thing we do before we can actually present the form to the user with the details that are going to be updated, of course, is we actually need those details. So we are going to actually have to get some information from the database. So the code for that looks like this. And remember, the connections string at the top, you need to change those for your local setup depending upon whether you're using MAMP on a PC, MAMP on a Mac, or you're using the Kingston University infrastructure. Whatever your local setup is going to be, something like that. So next up is to create the SQL. Now here we've got an emp number that's coming through from the previous form. That emp number is the employee number of the person that we want to edit. So if we want to retrieve those details, we simply go select star from emp where emp number equals, and then the number, the code that we're actually interested in, like 220 or something like that. And we're going to use that use database bit of code here. Once we've got that, what we need to do is we'll sort of print the result, print what comes back into the form. So we'll have 220 John Manager, for example, and we need to print it into the form so it's then editable. Now we've got a problem here. Use database is a function that we use, and use database when we use it, it returns two things depending upon how we use it. If we use it with a select statement, what it does is it just gives us a nice HTML table back, or if we use it with insert, update or delete, it returns how many rows were affected. Now, the problem with those is that neither of those are in a form that we can actually use to get information into the form in the HTML. So we're going to change use database a little bit so it works in a slightly different way. So use database, before, either it returned an HTML table, we could just print it out, or it simply returned a string, which was a message about how many records have been affected. We're going to change the way we use it. Now, the way that we change here is, if you look at it now, if you include the word array in quotes like that, so you have a look at the second line, you can see it says use database, $SQL, and array. What will happen is that rather than returning an HTML table or a kind of message, what we will actually get back is we'll get this internal database structure in PHP. It's like a link to a structure. And that's what will actually be inside result. Now we're not quite there, because what we'll then have to do is we'll have to take that structure and turn it into something that we can use. And to do that, we're going to use an internal function that comes in PHP, which is called MySQLi fetch array. So MySQL fetch array will work on the result that comes back from use database. What it actually does is it takes that internal complicated structural data set, whatever it is, and it turns it into an associative array. And we've talked about associative arrays before. So let me go through that again, because it's a little bit complicated. What will happen is we'll create our SQL. So the $SQL variable has just got words in it at the moment, and you can see the words in it would be something like select star from emp where emp number equals 220. So that's a string. That's what SQL, $SQL contains. We then send that off to the database using useDatabase. And when we do that, what happens is that result then contains a link to this internal structure. And the next step is to turn that structure into something that we can use. And that's what that function does, that MySQL fetch array. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see what it does there. It's converted the result into an associative array. And if you remember, the thing about associative arrays is that rather than use an index, they actually use a word or a label to actually enable us to access the individual values. And what's nice about MySQL fetch array is it automatically uses the column names, the attribute names from the table. So if you look at that structure, you can see we've got emp number, ename, job, manager, hire date, sal, com, department number, etc. with the appropriate values that we've retrieved. And of course, once we've got that, what we can now do is we can print it into the form. And the syntax that we use for associative arrays is to use that square bracket and the quotes. And you may remember that from when we've used post and get, because those are associative arrays. So what we'll do is we'll print those values into the form. So what does that look like? Well, here we are. So this is how we would write the HTML form if we just wanted to print the values 220 and John in there. So the important bit is if you look at the third line and you look at the fifth line of the HTML, you can see that we use that attribute value equals. Now there's no PHP in here at the moment. All I'm doing is I'm literally typing a value directly in. Now of course that doesn't work. What we really want to do is we actually want to print into those spots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace value equals with a little bit of PHP code that's going to print the value in that gap. And here it is. And you can make it out there. What I've done is I've gone print row emp number, print row ename. So whatever value comes back from that SQL statement will be printed into that gap as the default value that will then come up in the form for the user to edit. And there's a whole bunch of other fields which are very similar. There's manager number, hire date, salary, commission and department number. And it's the same process, so you can just about make that out. If I bring it up in red, print row manager, print row hire date, print row sal, print row com, print row department number. We're giving a value to the value attribute of that text box, and that actually prints the value into the cell for the user to edit. Now you may have spotted that we had emp number and ename and manager number, hire date, salary, commission and department number. There is one field on here which I haven't shown you yet, and that's the job field. And the reason that becomes a little bit more complicated is because that's a drop-down box. So what does that look like in HTML? Well, it looks like this. So this is the raw HTML that we would have for a drop-down box, a select box. The way that we express it is to use these different bits of HTML, so it looks like this. Now, of course, the problem is that what we want to do is we want to set the default one to be the value that comes from the database. So if we're editing someone who's a manager, we want manager to be the default value. If we're editing somebody who's the admin person, we want admin to be the default value, the one that's actually selected when the form comes up on the screen. Now the way that we do that is there's an attribute inside the option tag called selected. And you basically go selected, you put the word selected in here as an attribute against whichever one is the default one. So if manager was the one that was going to be selected, it would look something like this. And what that would do is that would actually have manager as the default value in the select box, in the drop-down box. Now, where it gets complicated, of course, is what we need to do is we need these green words to appear on one of those 5 rows depending upon what value comes back from the database. So we have to do it in PHP. And we're going to use an if statement. What we're going to do is we're simply going to test And we're going to basically say, if this person is an admin person, we'll print that selected green code into admin. If the person is an analysis person, we'll print it on that row. If it's a manager, we'll print it on that row. If it's a president, we'll print it there. And if it's a salesperson, we print it on the fifth and final row. Now that looks, unfortunately, it does look quite complicated because it looks like this. But if you just look closely, you should be able to see, if you look at the third line, you can see, so have a look at the third one, which is the third option value. If I bring it up in red, you can probably just about make out the code. So what we're saying is, if you look at the fourth line, if the job is admin, what we will do is we will print that selected statement in there next to the admin option field. If it's an analyst, we print selected in there. If it's a manager, we print selected in there. If it's a president, we print it in there, etc. all the way down. And that will work. That will give us all those values printed in at the right place. And that's basically emp update response. So in summary, what we've done is we've got an emp number from the emp update page. That's that first one on the left. That value's come through to emp update response. And what we've done there is we've taken that value, like 220, we've sent it off to the database and we get a result set back and we print it into the form. Of course, what comes next is the user will edit that form, change the values, and they click OK. And that's when we move on to the final page of the 3 pages, emp update response 2. And that's clearly the next one to look at.